Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with, yes, the Haydn Symphony Crusade. And we're up to number 63. And number 63 has a nickname, La Roxelane. Yeah, and Roxelane, well, we'll get to Roxelane in a minute. Here's the thing that I dreaded about this particular symphony. It exists in two versions. In the first version, Haydn uses trumpets and drums and an extra bassoon, which we don't have to worry about. And it's lovely, and it's delightful, and it's charming. It's just a terrific symphony. In the second version, the trumpets and drums go away, and Haydn replaces the last two movements, the minuet and the finale, with entirely new music. This freaked me out, frankly, because I was going to have to try and figure out, what was he doing and why. And also, I don't have an approved version, recording of the first version with the trumpets and drums that I can use for samples, which really annoyed me. Neville Mariner plays the first version, and Antal Dorati gives us both. So they're readily available on recordings, and you can hear them. But unfortunately, I don't have permissions for copyright reasons, so I'm going to have to work with the second version. But then I was thinking to myself, oh my God, how am I going to explain the difference between the two of them? Turns out, thank you, Haydn, it's actually rather simple, and it's wonderful. Oh my God, it's so wonderful because it really takes us into the mind of the great man himself, why he did this. The reason the trumpets and drums were missing is easy. It's the same reason that the second bassoon is missing. You can always use an extra one if you want. The second version, which was that Haydn's orchestra lost a bassoonist and trumpets and drums weren't available. And obviously the piece was popular. Things with nicknames tend to be. That's because it has a nickname. It was popular. So, he stuck the Roxelane movement, which is the slow movement, the second movement, into the symphony because it was popular. So there was demand for performance. He didn't have trumpets and drums, so he had to play it without. So he rewrote it without. But while he was rewriting without, he reached a point where he got to the minuet and said, it's not working the way it worked with trumpets and drums. So I need to do a little work here. And he did, and he replaced those movements. And the way that his thought process is really, really pretty clear. And like I said, it's just marvelous. And it all has to do with how Haydn creates symphonic unity. We always emphasize that in these talks because there's a tendency to think that, Haydn was... these classical symphonies are just four movements. They're not related to each other. They don't share themes. Therefore, there's no cohesion. But there is. There's tremendous cohesion. And Haydn really cared about that. And it's an aspect of his art as a symphonist and as a composer that really isn't discussed in the critical literature the way it should be. There's a lot of discussion of what he does within movements and, large-scale harmonic processes and things. But it's really much simpler than that. It really is. So let's get into that, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. You'll hear it right away when we play the second version without the trumpets and drums. The version with trumpets and drums is easy. Haydn creates unity in the symphonies with trumpets and drums at this stage in his career, basically, by having trumpets and drums. The movements with trumpets and drums automatically belong together because those instruments are there. And the Roxelane movement, the slow movement, does not have those instruments, which highlights it, which gives it a certain special quality because its scoring is different from all of the other movements which surround it. So you have both unity because of the three movements that employ trumpets and drums and a extra special quality for the second movement with its own special scoring. Very, very simple. Very, very simple. But when those instruments were gone, Haydn realized that the last two movements didn't really have anything in common, anything that might have fostered some sense of belonging with the first two movements. And so he made the change. and how he made the changes, what we're going to talk about in a minute. But you might want to know, who was Roxelane? That's a very good question. Roxelane was the wife of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, I think was his name. And Haydn wrote incidental music, that is stage music, for a play, Suleiman the Magnificent, or whatever it was called. And he used this movement to depict his wife. She was an amazing woman, by the way. In case you're curious, historically, she was actually born in Ukraine. She was kidnapped on a slave raid and taken back to Turkey, where she was purchased as a harem slave for Suleiman the Magnificent. She couldn't have been older than her teens, from which she rose through the haremistic ranks to become the wife, the actual wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, which was a big deal in those days because he married a commoner. You know, she was not only a commoner, but a slave. I mean, she was freed. She became his wife. She took over the whole harem. She bore him a bunch of kids, including his successor, the next Suleiman, whichever one that was. She had his all of her rivals murdered, wonderfully had them all killed, the children killed, although the previous head wife did rather well. Her son took care of his stepmom later in life. She didn't live all that long. She lived to be, I think, in her 50s or so, or 60s. But while she was in charge, she ran the empire for a while. She did tremendous public works and charitable things when she wasn't murdering her rivals, and really was one of the most prominent women of her age, an extraordinary personality, and Haydn gave her some extraordinary music, as we will hear momentarily. But the issue we need to deal with immediately is, how does Haydn unify, how does he create an overarching structure for this revised version of the symphony that doesn't have the trumpets and drums that would otherwise sort of patched it all together, that gave us that timbral familiarity that makes the piece cohere? Well, what he noticed two things. There are two qualities, and we can sum them up in two words: woodwinds and squiggles. That's all you need to know, woodwinds and squiggles. Because the very opening of the symphony, ba da dum da dum ba da bum bum ba da da dum 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 bum bum ba da da dum. You hear that ba da da dum? That's a squiggle. And the first movement is replete with squiggles. It's part of just its thematic substance. I don't know if Haydn was thinking anything particular about them, but they're there, and you will hear them when I play you the exposition. Immediately after the opening theme is played, it is repeated, and it is repeated solo by the woodwind section, which in this case is flute, oboes, and bassoons, and bassoon, or one bassoon, however many there are. It's a very, very characteristic sound, and it's one that Haydn noticed he was also using in the Roxelane movement. So he thought to himself, so I got squiggles, and I have an itch. Now, he's got squiggles, and he's got woodwinds that he can use. And so the revisions to the symphony are all about squiggles and woodwinds. We're creating new music that adds them, because those two qualities were notably absent from the special dedicated woodwind solos, were absent from the original minuet and finale, because he had trumpets and drums. So he didn't have to worry about it. Well, now he did. So we talk about the exposition now, to the opening movement, and I want you to listen to the solo woodwinds, which pop up all over the place. They're used very, very freely in this exposition, in the first subject and the second subject. Ya da 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 da, with the strings underneath going chuck 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 chuck. But you've got a lot of solo woodwind work, and you have ba da da dum, ba da da dum, da da da, ba da da dum, da da da, da da dum, ba ba ba, ba da da dum, ba ba. You've got these little squiggly figures. So listen to the squiggles, listen to the woodwinds, and here, with the Austro-Hungarian Haydn Orchestra under Adam Fischer, is the exposition to the first movement of La Roxelane, Symphony No. 63. So there you go, clear as day, right? You hear the woodwinds, you go, ooh, woodwinds, how nice. You hear the squiggles, you go, ah, it's doing squiggles. And then you can listen to the rest of the first movement at your leisure. And it is fun to compare this version to the version with trumpets and drums because it makes a very, very big difference that those instruments are now the loudest and most prominent things in the orchestra. You know, it diminishes the role of the woodwinds, and it sort of, you don't think of squiggles as much either. So there you go. Now, after this comes La Roxelane. Now, La Roxelane, it's easy to hear why this movement was so popular. And in a sense, Haydn sort of created the whole symphony around it. It's sort of like, well, the classical version of Scheherazade, if you want to call that. It's an exotic theme. It's exotic music. Haydn was very good at exotic music because, remember, he came from Hungary and he had Hungarian folk music in his blood, and he used it very frequently in his symphonies. We've talked about that before. In number 60, The Distracted, there's all kinds of Hungarian folk music all over the place. Well, here he creates a wonderful exotic theme and then 5 variations on that theme. The theme is in a minor key, which makes it sound more exotic. And we're going to go through them individually, just so you get the sense. Now, the theme is in 2 parts. Both are repeated. You know, it's A, A, B, B is the structure of the theme. But we're not doing the repeats because, you know, for time considerations, we're just going to hear the theme straight through and with both halves, and then each variation straight through until we get to the last one, which is a special case. So this wonderful, silky, sexy, evocative theme has, at the beginning of the second part, a very prominent squiggle. It goes dum 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 wada 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 dum bum, like that. So you listen for the squiggle. It gets squiggly. It's wonderfully squiggly. Woodwinds and squiggles. Keep it in mind. Here is the theme of La Roxelane. It really gets stuck in your head. It's really haunting. Sexy, isn't it? It's wonderful. It's an absolutely wonderful tune, and quite haunting and beautiful. Now, the first variation is for solo woodwinds. It's woodwinds, and it begins to get more squiggly as well. Dun dun ba da 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 ya da 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 ba da 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 da. You hear these squiggles start to take over because the melody becomes more ornate. Now, it's in a major key. It's friendly and warm and smiley, a little bit maybe even march-like. It sounds quite similar to the main theme that Haydn would use for the military movement in his Symphony No. 100, the military symphony. So it has that kind of quality to it. But anyway, here is the first variation, the first variation for woodwinds. It's the second appearance of the theme, and I always mess up my numbers, but it's the first variation. So you hear that those woodwinds, and you think, oh, remember that wonderful woodwind solo back in the first movement exposition, where we heard the woodwinds do the solo thing? Well, there you go. So we begin to hear this sort of quality of personality, of characterization that will unify the symphony. That's all he needs to do. So now the second variation is back in the minor key. It features the solo flute with the violins. It might be the most exotic sounding of all of them. It's really, really beautiful and really Eastern, Orientalist, if you want to call it that, Orientalist sounding. And yes, because of the flute, in the flute playing on top, ornamenting the melody, it's getting even squigglier. Here we go. It's back in the minor key also, the familiar minor key from the opening. Okay, so that's variation 2. Now, variation 3 alternates. We're back in the major key, and it alternates loud and soft. It also has plenty of squiggles, by the way, but not as many as like variation 2 did. The concept here is chamber music like small forces versus the full orchestra, and it's much more robust and vigorous than any of the previous variations that we've heard before. All of them are sort of rounding out the character of La Roxelane, and here she's very sensitive and then really pedal to the metal. So here is variation number 3. Okay, variation number 4. Well, variation number 4 returns to the minor key and the opening. The second part of variation 4 is extended a little bit more. It doesn't keep strictly to the metrical structure of the theme. And the squiggles have become the accompaniment. So you're da 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 bum bum ba da 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 da, and underneath it's wada 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 woo doo 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 doo, like this for the whole variation, basically almost the whole variation, and that really sort of gets the squiggles going. Here is variation 4. Variation 5 is the last variation, and it's what they call a double variation. Isn't that wonderful? There's a technical term for everything. Okay, a double variation is really very straightforward. What it means is that the repeats are varied as well. You don't hear A, B, B. You hear A prime, B, B prime. In other words, he diddles that. So what does he do with Variation 5? Well, this is the last variation. And so it actually serves as a coda to the whole set. He brings back the woodwind variation that we first heard as variation number 1. And it's a pretty literal repetition of the first part of that variation. And then the whole orchestra comes crashing in, reminiscent of variation number 3, with the squiggles, which have become actually, the melody is more or less buried in violin squiggles galore. The squiggles take over everything. And in the second half, so you're going to hear the first half, both parts of it, because it's first woodwinds, then full orchestra playing the A section, the first section of the melody. And then the B section, I only play once, because the last time it comes back, it's the very end of the movement, and Haydn wraps it up with a couple loud chords, yum, yum, and it's over. We don't need to go there. So here is Variation 5, the varied first part and the complete second part, where you have the most important ideas in the whole symphony: woodwinds and squiggles. Go for it. Now there you have it. That's La Roxelane. That's what made the symphony the hit that it was. And you see, one of the things that people talk about all the time in these middle period symphonies, when Haydn was really busy doing theatrical music, he was writing operas, he was producing operas by everybody, because Prince Esterhazy had his private opera house and his private orchestra and private performing troupe. He had a marionette theater. Haydn was supposed to write music for all these things. He had to compose operas. He had to produce operas by other composers that were popular in the day. And then he had to write everything else that he was. It's just unbelievable how busy he was. So people tend to think that these symphonies lack, the cohesion and interest of his earlier symphonies, where he was focusing on that, or the later ones where they were special commissions, or, he was the symphony guy. Well, that's bullshit, frankly. He's showing enormous care. And this is the example that proves it, really, because he jettisoned the next 2 movements when he had to rewrite the thing, when he had to play the symphony without trumpets and drums. So we come to the minuet. Now, the minuet originally, the one with trumpets and drums, as I said, it had trumpets and drums in the first part, and then a trumpet and drumless middle section, or trio. Well, Haydn initially, it seems, and this is speculation, but it makes sense, came up with the idea of redoing the trio to add woodwinds. And I'm going to play you the redone trio right now with it's wonderful. My goodness, it's a solo for oboe with bassoon, doing what bassoons do, underneath the oboe. It's delightful, and it brings back woodwinds, that incredibly important idea of woodwinds. Here it is. So that's the trio. But see, Haydn had an issue. The issue is that the original minuet, the one with the trumpets and drums, is connected to its trio. In other words, the trio employs the same motives, the same music as the minuet proper. So he couldn't just replace the trio. It would have destroyed the cohesion of the whole movement, basically. And so he found an opportunity. an opportunity to add some squiggles in addition to the woodwinds to the new minuet theme. And in addition to adding these squiggles to the new minuet theme, he used the same squiggles to start the finale. Just speed it up a lot. The opening of the minuet and the opening of the finale are mirror images of each other, because the minuet begins with loud squiggles that get soft. The finale begins with quiet squiggles that get loud. That's what happens. But if you listen to the two, the opening of the minuet, and then imagine it really speeded up, you basically get the finale. And so I've juxtaposed them here so that you can hear the opening of the new minuet and the opening of the new finale right next to each other, and you'll see it's the same thing. It's squiggly, 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 all over the place. You see, you got both. You get squiggles and woodwinds in the new minuet, squiggles in the finale, and also not as much woodwinds in the finale. It's a very fast movement that's just all full of energy and motion and lots of brilliant passages for the full orchestra. But you still hear woodwinds, woodwind coloring all over the place. I'm going to play you the exposition of the finale, and with that we will have the entire La Roxelane summarized. Here is the exposition, the opening section of the finale, the new finale. There it is. You see? Woodwinds and squiggles. I can't repeat it enough. Yeah, it's probably you've heard enough of it by now, but you get it, right? Isn't it marvelous? And we hear Haydn's genius at work, creating unity out of a situation that he had, the practical situation of what instruments are available, what am I going to do about it? And how important it was when he wrote these symphonies that they had that cohesion. Even when, as here, the central movement, the most important movement, which is the slow movement, actually came from elsewhere. He managed to create, in his second version, an even more coherent, more symphonically cogent view of the work as a whole, taking as his inspiration La Roxelane. And she was quite a lady because she generated quite a symphony. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.